Hey everyone, we are going to go into chapter 12 within this textbook of contemporary nutrition. It's going to discuss our food supply, how it is kept safe or how it keeps our consumers safe, and then what is the difference between all of this GMO and organics and biotechnology? Is it safe for us? Should we be choosing all natural or 100% organic? Is it healthier for us? Better for our environment? So we're going to look at some of these issues today in chapter 12. All right, so I've highlighted a few things within the outcomes I want you to pay attention to as we go through this information. For the first being, I want you to be able to tell me what is the difference between conventional and sustainable agriculture. What is the definition of organic foods, also organic farming? What is everything to do with biotechnology? What does it mean? Are there differences in how food is grown and produced using food biotechnology versus conventional farming? Also, let's look at number two is what is all this information and misinformation about pesticides use? Is it harmful? Is our foods that we are eating safe, or should we be eating pesticide free? And what is pesticide free or organic, anyways? Are there health implications? Are there safety limitations in place, and should we trust those? Number three is also learning what those common sources of foodborne pathogens are. How do we get foodborne illnesses? Why do we seem to have certain areas or restaurants or, um, I guess, cooking methods that tend to actually be more riskier than others when it comes to getting a foodborne illness? And then what about food preservation methods? How do we preserve our foods? Is it additives or preservatives? Are those safe as well? Number four, we're looking at foodborne illnesses. We're going to look at some specific ones that seem to be more prominent. And foodborne illnesses can be caused by a variety of different pathogens, including viruses and bacteria, and then also some parasites. Number five, we're going to look at some of the main reasons for using some of those chemical additives, why they are an important part of our food supply. I'm not going to get too far into memorizing certain types of additives. I just want you to understand some of the basic information when it comes to those. Number six, we'll look at how do we reduce our own risk for a foodborne illness, especially during some of our more vulnerable times, such as pregnancy for our young children and also for our older adults. All right, fact checked. So, are organic products really worth the extra cost? So, if you've been to a um, general grocery store, you will know that there is a regular side of the produce section, and then there's organic, usually a lot smaller and a lot pricier. And there's a big reason, or multiple reasons actually, that those foods do cost more. Are they worth it? And is it actually, can we have some negative health impacts because of organic produce? And we'll look into that as well. We'll also look at the residues that are on both organic and non-organic produce, because if we're really worried about pesticides, if we're choosing organic because of that, and we don't want to introduce our bodies to it, then we need to be able to understand, are there certain types of produce that tend to have more? Should we trust that so-called dirty dozen and some of the clean 15? What we do understand is that from a plethora amount of research is that both organic and non-organic foods, most of them, in fact, 99% of them, do not have pesticide residues by the time you get them home. And that's not including just washing them. So I have a big kind of love-hate relationship with some of the organic farming because I do really like some of the methods that are used for organic farming, but if you understand agricultural in general, you will understand that most farmers use both of those, whether they are organic farmers or not, because organic methods have been used for generations. Because you don't want to have to go and purchase pesticides, and you don't want to have the time and the employees to be able to go out and put them on there. But you do also want to have a good crop yield because you cannot sustain farming and also be able to feed the world without being able to actually harvest food that has not been ate up by disease or pests. So the good thing is I'm going to show you how you can feel, really rest assured when it comes to eating produce, whether it is organic or non-organic, because we know that the majority of populations of Americans do not eat the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables. And so if we were to really limit it and say, hey, I know we're supposed to eat fruits and vegetables, but if you don't eat the organic ones, you're probably going to end up hurting yourself or giving you cancer or something like that. That's really just making things worse. And overall, tons of health concerns, disease, and a higher quality of life can really be achieved by eating more fruits and vegetables. So we don't want anything out there that is going to cause fear mongering and cause people to eat less fruits and vegetables in general. And then I want you to understand by the end of this that you should really be able to trust science and trust some of the organizations that we have out there, some of those science-based organizations, and being able to look up this information on your own. I don't know, there's a lot of sometimes people who fear governmental organizations or a certain one, but there are many that are out there that are there cross-checking one another to make sure that the food that they say is safe for you to eat is also safe for their own families to eat as well. All right, so this very first section of chapter 12, we're going to look at what are those basic requirements for food manufacturers to be able to say that their food is actually organic. I want you to be able to list two characteristics that define a food as being bioengineered. And you can see that the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standards, the NBFDS, are those that set these standards that really consider a food being grown using bioengineering. And then what is the exact definition of sustainable agriculture, and why should we be so concerned in trying to support sustainable foods? All right, so I want to give you a little bit to think about, some statistics here, and I don't need you to memorize these statistics, but I want you to understand what's going on with our food supply and demand. And when you look at this picture down here, just loosely look at these numbers, it just means nothing, but to see this graphic, you get an understanding here that our population growth is definitely on the increase, but our resources and the ability to supply the food that is absolutely necessary in order to sustain that population that is growing is declining. So why is that occurring? Well, less than 1% of the population here in the US are actually involved in farming. Around the world, only 1 in 3 people actually produce food. So less people producing, of course, compared to the amount of food that is required to feed the world. And a lot of times we hear the word big pharma, and we naturally will think about big pharma being associated with pharmaceutical sales, but I'm not using it in that context at this moment. I'm using it as big. Let's see. Oh, it's not going to. Oh, give me a second. So big. I want to say pharma. A lot of our food supply actually comes from individually owned family farms. Agriculture, of course, is sustained by our large farms, but the smaller farmers do supply a significant amount of the food. However, it's getting more and more difficult to be able to sustain life in this economy as a farmer. When we think about just driving down the road and you see a lot of our farms that are up for sale because it's more sustainable to sell your land for the amount that land is going now than to actually work day in and day out and make very small amounts of money in order to raise your family at the cost of living these days. In fact, about maybe 14 cents of every dollar that is spent on food actually goes back to the farmer itself and their family. And this is a big decline from 1975 when 40% of, not 40%, but 40 cents of every dollar actually went back to the family. So it's definitely not easy to feed your family as a farmer, if so to speak. Think about, so now we have less land that is available to farm, yet our population is steadily increasing. About 8% increase in our US population in over the last 10 years. And from just 2023 to 2024, our population went from 339 million, this is rough, up to 341 million. So that's a big increase on food needs, yet the amount of food being produced here is declining. And this is what's going to lead us into a discussion of sustainable farming and also being a consumer who chooses to eat those foods that are sustainably grown. Um, Continuing on looking at the amount of land that has actually declined here from 1992, and I don't have an updated one, but 1992 to 2012, the cropland decreased from 460 million acres to 392 million acres. So you can imagine now, if I had new statistics in the last 12 years, how big of a decline that would also continue to really limit our food supply. Um, Not only that is that, and I'm not going to get into our water supply, but that is a very huge issue and a pressing issue that a lot of departments are really looking at, state departments are looking at, is how do we continue to supply enough water to meet the demands of people, because that is also significantly declining and also affecting the resources that we require in order to produce food. So when we are looking at how do or what types of factors really go into affecting our food supply, we have organic food production. Now, is this something that actually helps our food supply or hinders our food supply? And we really could spend a whole probably semester discussing organic farming, because a lot of it is very good, because we use different methods in order to reduce the necessary pesticides and runoffs from that food supply. However, organic farming requires much, much more land, and also, those who are tending to the land and the crops in order to produce a good yield. Food biotechnology can also benefit our food production. Since our amount of land to grow food is declining rapidly, we really are going to have to get very technologically savvy to produce enough food to feed the world. And then sustainable agriculture. There's a lot of different forms that this will also encompass in order to understand how will we feed the future of the world. All right, before we get into sustainable agriculture, I want to make sure that you understand organic foods. So, your book actually has, I noticed in one of the definitions, it defined organic foods a little wrong, incorrect. So, organic foods, this says that it prohibits is synthetic pesticides. Now, your book says pesticides point blank. That's not true. Actually, pesticides are allowed in organic foods. It limits which types of pesticides, and like non-organic foods, it limits the amount. You can't have hormones in the production of those foods. You cannot use sewage sludge in order to, fertilize the crops, but you can use manure. So we're still thinking of a form of sewage there. You cannot use genetic engineering, and you cannot use irradiation, which I'll define later on for you. A lot of our synthetic substances and also our natural pesticides can still be used in organic crop production, and this is where the slide is correct, but it's not correct in your textbook. All right, our farming practices that are used in order to help ensure good crop yield: biological pest management, composting, manure applications, and crop rotation. All of these are very common organic methods in production. All right, now just because something says it's organic does not mean that it's 100% organic. In order to actually carry this seal that you see on the slide, this means it is 100% organic, means everything, all the ingredients is 100% grown organically. But if you see something that says made with organic ingredients, or there's some other different organic labeling that we'll look at as well, it cannot be classified as 100% USDA organic unless all of it is. But it's a very small fraction of our foods that are actually 100% organic. In fact, it wouldn't be sustainable to feed the population on organic foods just by itself. I do need you to understand that the organic foods are labeled based upon the USDA regulations who define those standards. which was established in 1990 by the Organics Food Production Act. All right, so here are some of those terms that were I was referencing earlier on. Um, Organic doesn't mean the exact same thing when you're looking at labels. If it carries that seal and it meets the 100% of these standards, because all of the ingredients, excluding water and salt, it can carry that organic seal. 95% organic means that those ingredients, a lot of our packaged, it says breakfast cereal here, but a lot of our packaged products means that 95% of their ingredients by weight meet organic standards. And then 70% organic, at least 70% of the ingredients are organic. Um, our small organic producers, those farmers, a lot of times the ones that you may see at a local farm, uh, are not required to actually meet these regulations and standards. So if they make less than about $5,000 per year, they're exempt from having to meet these standards. So they can go ahead and put on maybe their little booth that they're selling that they are organic farm and not kind of meet those regulations or get harmed for using those standards. Um, some of our farmers use organic production, but they choose not to actually be USDA certified, and this is because it is costly to actually have your farm audited. So you have to be careful on some of those smaller producers if that really is something that is important to you. It is not to me, and I can explain later on with some of the more information. Hopefully, you will understand why I don't put a lot of emphasis on uh, purchasing organic food only. All right, so our USDA organic problems, they have very strict production and labeling requirements set by the USDA. Um, in order to be organic, if we're looking at those organic standards that we were referencing in the last slide, they have to be produced without any of the excluded methods. So that's going to be GMOs, your genetic engineering, ionizing radiation, which is irradiation, and also the sewage sludge. Um, they have to be produced using all the allowed substances, and there's a very long list if you look to the USDA organic labeling. And then they have to be overseen by the USDA National Organic Program, which is accredited by a certifying agent, and they are annually audited by those standards and regulations. And you can see on this picture here, you see that USDA seal. All right, so let's get real about organic farming and foods. Are they healthier for you? Are they more nutritious for you? Do they help to protect the environment? I'm going to give you the answer here. If you see a test question that says organic foods are more nutritious for you, your answer there is going to be false. Absolutely not. We have no evidence, and there has been countless studies done over and over to understand, is there any nutritional quality difference between conventional farming or organic farming? The answer is no, there's not. Then the next thing is there any, are these foods safer for you when it comes to the amount of pesticides that those foods have on them? And the answer is generally no. I would say 99% of the foods within the grocery store, that's including organic and conventionally grown produce, have residue content on them that are below any type of standards, and those standards are set hundreds of times less than what could potentially cause any harm. And so those organic foods, they cost a lot more for you. They usually have less variety when it comes to the options to choose from. They tend to are more likely to have little bites out of them because they don't have any of the, I guess, I hate to use the word pesticides because people are so afraid of it. But understand that a pesticide could be something that's completely natural, and understand that something that is completely natural, whether it's labeled organic or non-organic, can be just as risky or just as safe. Remember that manure that comes from animal uh, byproduct waste is 100% natural. But believe me, there are tons of things within that manure that can be very harmful to you if you don't practice good safety precautions like washing your fruits and vegetables. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of information about how you can research some of the foods that you eat. There's some of that ridiculous Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen that's come out by the EWG every year. It usually makes all of us laugh at it, for those who are involved in nutrition science, because it's really just a bunch of garbage and based on really, really bad science. A majority of experts out there will say that both conventional foods and organic foods are safe, and like I said, 99% that are audited, which hundreds of thousands are audited annually and checked by various organizations, not just the FDA and the EPA, but other organizations are cross-referencing to check to make sure that periodically these foods are checked to make sure that any type of residue that are on them, organic or not, are well below these standards. 99% of them, they're completely following those regulations. So keep in mind, that's before you take it home and wash it and eat it. Also, if you peel off something, of course, I don't want you to because I want you to have that fiber, but let's just say it's something that you do peel, like a banana. Again, you're not going to have pesticide exposure to that particular food because you're not eating the peel that could have had some pesticides on it, but it does not. But I want you to feel safe within our food supply, whether it is organic or not organic. So if you were to ask me or any of my colleagues, Dr. Funderburg, Will Fong, Great House, so forth, anybody down the hall, do you purchase organic ingredients? They're probably going to laugh and say, no, we do not. The only time I do is if it happens to be less expensive than the non-organic foods, because we know the data, we know the research in there, we know where we can go if we are concerned and check the reports that are annually audited. So please, if you hear the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen, please just laugh at that report and cast it aside. It does not mean anything. It sounds really scientific, but it's just really bad science. Nutritionally speaking, no difference between the vitamin content. The only thing that could potentially be different if it is just one of those local markets, it's just been harvested, just picked, it could have a little bit more vitamins and minerals, but please understand that overall around the world, especially here in the US, we have big problems with people not eating enough fruits and vegetables to begin with. And so we don't want people having fear mongering put in there and thrown in there for being one of the reasons why they don't purchase fruits and vegetables, because maybe that fruit or vegetable that they needed was not being sold organically or offered from the organic section. Unless you live in a big city, the selection for organic foods is very small. And so you don't have a lot of good variety. And again, if that hinders your purchasing and consumption of fruits and vegetables, please, please disregard any reason for buying that organic food. I do definitely support our local farmers who may or may not be selling organic foods or labeling them so as organic, and we'll discuss that a little bit more on the next slide. Okay, so before I show you some of the reports that shows how much pesticides are actually on the foods that we eat, or when the annual audits, I want to give you a way of understanding how these tolerances are actually, how they come to pass. And the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, they use what's known as a risk cup, meaning they are going, say if we had a cup in front of us, if I can get this to work, we have a cup in front of us, and this is going to encompass every form of exposure to a pesticide that you could come in contact, meaning from food, and it can be from environment, and then it could be something as far as maybe exposure through work, any way that the average consumer could come in contact with a particular chemical. And so it's going to be different from one chemical, pesticide, herbicide, fungicide to another, one different for per brand. And they're going to add it all up, and they're going to set the amount based upon animal studies, largely amongst animal studies, that if you were someone that was, um, say, that consumed or came in contact with that particular chemical every day for 70 years, how much of it could you actually come in contact with before it overflowed your cup and caused harm? And does not mean that it caused death. It could cause aches and pains, nausea, vomiting, other types of ill effects from exposure to it. Now, remember, it is the dose that makes the poison, but also the frequency that that poison is consumed when it comes to any substance out there. And so once they find out how much that is established as the tolerance. Here is that word, tolerance, that is set per chemical. And then they find out that, well, so that's not actually the tolerance, but whatever could actually pose that harm that has actually overflowed that cup, they're going to set it far below that. And that's just for safety, right? That's a threshold, meaning make sure if it's this much, we want to make sure that we're going to set the level far below that because we want to make sure that we have some cushion, some room in there. And so if, let's say, the actual amount that overflowed your cup on a particular chemical is 0.75 parts per million. They're going to set it way far down. You're going to see something like 0.075 as the threshold. Now remember, you would have to consume that amount every single day of that chemical for 70 plus years in order to experience an adverse effect. So I think your textbook gives you an example of, let's say that a little girl, so a small-bodied individual. Remember, the smaller you are, the more likely you are to have a lower tolerance to any type of chemical that's out there, good or bad. And so, your dosage is going to have to be a lot lower. She would have to consume, I think, 80 tons of strawberries every single day in order to actually breach this threshold of a common type of pesticide that is used on strawberries itself. I'm just trying to make sure that to put this into perspective for you so that you understand that even though we may, on the next page, look at some of these tolerances or reports, if we do find some produce, either organic or conventionally grown, that we're actually seeing on an audit that had that chemical, remember, that person would have to consume a very large, abnormally large amount of that particular food that had that pesticide every single day for years in order to actually be at risk most of the time. There's always an exception, but for the majority of our foods, that is why so many food experts out there will not put too much weight into buying organic types of foods. Remember, you still have to wash those. Hopefully, you wash those foods, whether they are organically grown or not. So the threshold here, understand that we have a big safety net in there. That amount, again, reduce 100 to 1,000 times fold in order to just have that cushion in there for safety. And that is just all foods, organic or non-organic foods. All right, so if you want to find out information about the foods that you eat, you and anybody can do a search on the USDA's website. There are other websites that you can look for this information on, like EPA. I think the FDA also has a link as well, but you can get different reports. I just pulled up the USDA's. This is from 2022. And you can actually do a database search. So you could go in and look for a specific food. I just did a really quick search. If you were interested on a specific pesticide, you could search for that, or I clicked all of them, and then you could get the year report as well. And you could do that, or you could go to the full booklet, which I do recommend because it does tell you uh, it gives you perspective about what types of pesticides are indicated as more harmful. It gives you some of the acronyms and explanation of those and what some of the data on those reports do mean. So you can briefly skim over that. and then be able to pull up the appendices at the very end of this document, which of course there are going to be pages and pages of different foods that will show you their amount of pesticides, if there are any that are found. And I'll give you an example of a screenshot on the next slide. Oh, so as you can see, here is a very quick, it's actually two different pages here in the Appendix B, and I happen to land on, I think, a lot of baby foods here. And so it lists these foods that were audited, tells you how many samples that they collected. So they're not just choosing one or two to look at, they're looking at a variety of different locations and a variety of different samples. And then it will tell you how many samples had an actual detection. And it will list them by different types of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, etc. on there, each individually. You can also pull a different report that will just list them all together. There's many different ways to search this information up for you. And then it will tell you the percentage of samples that actually did have detection. You can see that there were not any in this particular screenshot. And then it will tell you if what the actual tolerance level is recommended for, and if there are any violations of that tolerance that were found on any of these samples, you'll see an X here, and I wish I would have taken a screenshot of one. Of course, you're going to find some, but do remember that this is both organic and non-organic foods all together. All these produce are put together, and it will also give you fresh produce and packaged food products so that you can get an idea, and it will be able to list all those different types of pesticides and give you a summary or explanation of that in case you don't want to look at the data and just kind of get an overview of what it is the information is providing you. But it would have an X on here. Now remember, again, if it is found to have anything, whether it's organic or non-organic, you would have to understand how often that particular food is consumed, the frequency of it, and how much it is, and then also what type of pesticide it is. Some of them are virtually harmless, and some of them, if consumed on a regular basis in extremely extraordinary amounts, actually could pose a harm. So dosage and frequency is most important to understand when looking at this. But in summary, with all this information, I'm just trying to give you an idea to understand that whether you purchase organic or non-organic foods, your food here provided by the U.S. Food Supply or agricultural methods, and even overseas international foods, are most likely to be very, very safe. 99% of them are well below the tolerance levels, and of those, close to 50% absolutely have zero detection of any form of pesticide on them. All right, now let's skip over to food biotechnology. And food biotechnology is going to encompass a few different types of methods of foods, how foods are manipulated in order to produce a better product or in order to increase yield. Now, biotechnology has been around since the beginning of time, when you would pick your very best product from your farm. Let's say the best plant in your crop that produced the most flawless, let's say corn or tomato, potato, or the largest one. Or let's go over to agriculture, looking at animals. So your largest steer, and you want to be able to make sure that those genetic traits are used again. And so within crops, you're going to take those seeds from the very best ones, and you're going to keep them, and you're going to use the majority of those, to plant more of them. And then when you get the next year's crop from that large, great plant, you're going to take the seeds from those. You're going to continue to expand upon those resources of seeds. So this has been going on since the beginning of time. Same thing with, again, animals. You're going to pick your very best ones and use those in reproduction. And so when it comes to genetic engineering, it's just the manipulation of genetic makeup of any organism with recombinant DNA. So what happens? Well, in order to use the old technology, not technology, but traditional way of doing so, you have to wait year after year in order to get the results of it and to be able to reproduce. So you can at least understand that would take centuries and a long time in order to produce those really great crops, the crops that produce a lot more, or maybe they are more resistant to cold, etc. They seem to survive better, or some types of produce tend to be more resistant to bacteria, viruses, and pests itself. So you don't have to put as much pesticides on them. So obviously that would be a great thing for everyone. So this speeds it up a little bit. So genetic engineering and anything that uses genetic engineering, which is what it's saying down here, is called genetically modified organism (GMOs). Has used this form of technology. And to speed this up, you use a bacteria, and that bacteria is kind of like an enzyme. It goes in, it's inserted into a specific trait, gene within a DNA, and it clips that desirable trait. I give you an example of that is, let's say that we have a tomato that is a type of variety. If you've ever planted tomatoes, you can go in and you can look. There are many different types of species to choose from, and some of them tend to be more hardy than others, meaning that they need less water, less attention. And if you're anything like me, seem to kill everything that I try to plant. You're going to want those that need a little bit less attention and work. Now, if you're a farmer, of course, the more you're able to produce, the more you're able to actually get economically. And as a society, we are able to feed more people. And so we want bigger yields. If a tomato species happens to be resistant to cold, then we can take that gene that's within it, clip it using a bacteria, natural bacteria that does it for us, and then you just put it in a petri dish, and it automatically will also combine with the DNA. And so now you have another species of tomato. We took the resistant tomato gene from it, combined it with the use of bacteria in order to insert it in there. It sounds scary, but it's actually, if you understand it, it's kind of simplistic, and it's doing things that naturally occurs on its own, just kind of as the strongest survive. And we can actually do that from species to other species. I can take, let's say, vitamin A. If we look at yellow rice, now understand that blindness is caused worldwide. The largest form of blindness cause is from vitamin A deficiency. And vitamin A in certain countries, those foods that would be a great source of it, are scarce. But rice is a food staple in many of the developing countries that tend to have a lot of problems with malnutrition. And it's very stable on the shelf, and you can do a lot of things with it. And so, since it's such a large portion of the world's food supply, if we can take, let's say, vitamin A, and we can take that gene within a plant, let's say carrots, and we can take it and we can transport it into rice, beta carotene, that would not normally have it in there. Now it just enhanced the nutritional quality in it, and we have reduced the leading worldwide cause of blindness, um, drastically, and that helps that economy within that country that's developing to have less problems with poor food production, and helps them to be able to sustain their own society as well. So we have hundreds and different types of foods within, especially corn, wheat, soybeans, that are using genetically engineered crops, especially here in the US, because we have the data behind us to support their safety and also the benefits from them. So this slide over here, I'm just reading it, says global studies of biotechnology crops over the past 20 years confirm significant benefits of biotech crops. GMO technology has reduced chemical pesticide by 35%. So if you are someone, even though we kind of learned a little bit about that, that's concerned about the use of pesticides, maybe also for the environmental concerns, then using this biotechnology of GMOs helps to reduce us ever having to put it out there in the first place. Not only that, we already learned that our food supply is kind of at risk, and so it helps to increase our crop yield because we can make more of a species of a plant that seems to be resistant to pests, and that means that we'll harvest more and be able to supply more. And it's also helped the local farmer, so therefore it's going to help hopefully keep more farmers in business and allow them to keep their land and continue to feed our world. This gives you an idea of that biotechnology that's used in genetic modification. So let's say we have a DNA here, we have a gene within this DNA that we found out it is very resistant to a pest. It could be maybe a type of worm, it could be an insect, like some type of spider that tends to normally feed on a plant. And yet this species of that plant tends to be resistant, or it could be a completely different species altogether. We can clip that out using a bacteria. Now we have that desirable trait right here that is being shown in blue, and we can use it in order to insert it into the species that we want to produce more, be more resistant to that pest. And now you have an example of more of a pest resistant type of crop. Another way is to be able to enhance the nutritional quality. We know that omega 3s are really great for a variety of things, including your brain function, also your immune system, and cardiovascular system. And so we can enhance the amount in the same way. If we find omega 3s in one species, and we can put that particular gene that does cause that crop to have high levels of omega 3 fatty acids, put it into another one. And we can use that to naturally produce it in those foods or also to produce some pharmaceuticals. All right, now, in order to provide the information to be transparent to consumers, they do require that any type of uh, bioengineered foods require a label on there. So you'll see a bioengineered label, such as one of these, if they have had any of the technology used. Um, this is it's not found in your textbook, but I think it gives you an idea of what we're looking at as far as our need for food and our resources. It's projected an increase of, from our 2010 to 2050 that we're going to need 56% more food to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. So looking at the population, definitely increasing the need for resources. But we're going to need it without using more land because the production of food and land resources that require that is dwindling. So we also need to consider the fact that we have to be cautious of the emissions. So we want to make sure that we don't worsen our climate changes, and we want to be respectful to any type of greenhouse emissions. And so, yet we need more, and our resources are less, and our caution for contributing that carbon footprint is more of a growing concern now. That really complicates the situation. And so when we use these different farming methods like biotechnology, genetically modified uh, crops and organisms and farming practices, it really does help to tackle these problems altogether. It requires less land, less herbicides, and less emissions as well. So, sustainable agriculture, our overall goals here in using sustainable agriculture is to provide enough food to meet our needs, to enhance our environment and the quality of it, and to efficiently use non-renewable resources, right, that we know that are dwindling, to sustain our economic viability of farm operations, right? Because this is going to, the more food we need, those farm operations are going to also require resources of their own, and then to enhance the quality of life of those farmers and those workers that are working so hard in order to produce the food that we need. Let's give you some examples of sustainable farming practices. And this is really applies a lot more, or is more of a concern for our agriculture here on the land instead of thinking about fishing, because fishing really does produce a lot less, let's say, carbon emissions because of the less need for resources with fishing. There is problems with overfishing, but they seem to be a lot more on top of that than where we are trying to gain ground on our planting of crops. I would say crop rotation is a method that is used by both organic and non-organic farmers. And realize that, I just want to preface this, a lot of times we will have a lot of panels of experts that will come in that are farmers and agriculture experts from all over the country, and they'll talk about their practices and what they know and provide knowledge. And what they a lot of times will say is that they do both. They do organic farm crops and non-organic in order to really just meet consumers' desires. It's not really because if they have a belief that one practice is better than the other, they really want to be able to sell their product, and of course they have to sell to the consumers in that area. So overall, they want to be able to use the less amount of resources financially in order to produce the greatest amount of crops. And crop rotation is one thing because we know that the soil content is what is required to produce a very healthy crop. You don't have good soil content, for example, strawberries, try to grow strawberries here in Texas is very difficult because of the nutrient quality within the soil and what it requires in order to do so. And every time you harvest that, you are stripping the soil of those nutrients. And so if you rotate what nutrients are required for one crop to the other one, then you're helping to preserve some of the nutrients in that soil instead of steadily stripping the land of those. Intercropping, a good example of this is the Three Sisters. If you've ever learned about the Indian um, story of the Three Sisters, where you have corn and let's see, these corn, green beans, and the third one is squash together. When you plant those three crops together, one assists the other in producing better. So the one can produce more shade to cover to protect the produce and also the soil. One helps to stabilize, let's say the beans as the ivy kind of goes around. If you've ever seen those, it helps to stabilize those stalks and keep them from bending so much in the wind, etc. But so you can see how one crop can help the other. So just using that knowledge itself. Another is step farming. As our land dwindles, we have to be able to be very resourceful in what land we do have. So if you are farming on areas with very rugged, let's say cliff types or hillsides, it's very difficult to do so just logistically, but also remember that rain comes down and then it carries that soil and the nutrients within that soil away from it, therefore producing less of a, well, I say nutritious, but also less of a yield because you don't have the nutrients in that soil in order to produce a good crop. And so terracing is kind of like cutting in to that side of the hillside in order to keep that rain from washing it in. And the book gives you a good illustration of what that looks like, or you can Google it. But it just kind of is very aesthetically really pleasing, but it's just kind of what it sounds like, terraces, in order to be able to produce that crop and also keep in the water and nutrients within that hillside. Another information about sustainable living and eating as a consumer. If you want to support good sustainable food production overall, there are lifestyles of healthy and sustainability, LOHAS. This is kind of the overall thought and organizations and resources in order to continue our good food supply. Our food industries help to respond to more sustainable green initiatives, those types of farming practices that produce less greenhouse emissions. We also have nonprofits that help to educate and empower Americans in order to build a good food system that is sustainable, teaching communities and also individuals how do they grow their own foods, not in order to sustain all of their nutrient needs, but you can have a patio garden. You can also have like hanging baskets in order to produce some food supply. And also, how do we reduce the amount of food waste, realizing that such a large amount of the food that's produced is being just wasted either in the market or you take it home and you don't actually use it, and that food just goes into the waste, and that's some more emissions that are going out there and less mouths that are being fed with our very slowly gradually declining food supply. Okay, I am a very big proponent of reducing food waste. Someone that has worked in agriculture and also food production, I see for myself how much of our food supply is actually wasted, and that is really undermining our sustainability of our overall food supply and systems. So think about from the very beginning of food production, cultivating, transporting that food, processing, storing, cooking, and preparation as well. Really account for 70% of our water use, and about one third of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So not only are we not actually getting that food that we need in order to help to eliminate hunger, we are actually wasting our valuable resources and a lot of those natural resources that are starting to dwindle. Um, It's estimated that one third of our global food production is wasted. I probably ask you how many times you've had some fresh produce in your refrigerator or on the counter and you never get to it, you don't realize it's there, or it just goes bad before you consume it and it's just thrown out and wasted. So, how do we actually fix this? What can you do? Well, there are 7 ways that we can start, or 7 practices we can use in order to reduce food waste. Number one, plan ahead and only buy what you know for sure that you're going to use. Love your leftovers. I know people have a big issue sometimes with leftovers, but there's a lot of methods that we can use in order to recook those or reuse those and make them taste and also the texture of those very palatable. So when we're throwing those out, we're really contributing to a really big problem with food sustainability. And if you have worked in probably a restaurant, you realize how much of that is actually tossed out. And it doesn't need to be. There's a lot of programs out there and regulations and laws that actually protect those restaurant owners in order to be able to provide leftovers at night. In fact, in Austin, it is considered a crime if you are over a restaurant and you toss out your unused food. We need to understand exactly what those dates that are posted on product labels mean, the best fuse by dates versus expired. Just because you have surpassed the best by use date does not mean that you have to throw it out, that it's going to hurt you. Even the expiration date, those are things that you really need to gauge for yourself. It has a lot to do with how you store your foods. Do you have your refrigerator stored, actually set at a good temperature below 41 degrees? Do you leave your food out on the counter, like the same milk, for instance? It can really well exceed the expiration date if you keep it in the refrigerator. Now, if you're someone who takes out the milk jug and then you go and you make some coffee and then maybe you go and wash your face, brush your teeth, and then come back and make your cereal and the milk jug is still sitting out there, the longer it sits out at room temperature, that is what speeds up the expiration date. It's not some magical number that has been stamped on the side of the jug that actually causes it to expire. You really need to investigate that for yourselves. So store it properly. Learn to love your freezer. If you have extra, you can definitely freeze it immediately and use that. Donate it, as I mentioned before, and also learn how to be able to use it as compost because that is a very great way to be able to not waste and also to reproduce food for yourself or others. The EPA food recovery hierarchy. This is a pyramid here that helps to understand or put in perspective how we can help to produce more or have a more sustainable food production. So at the very top of this, you see source reduction. At the very bottom of you see landfill incineration. This is that last resort to disposing of food, but there are many things in between that we can use food for before we just toss it in the trash. You can help to donate that to others. It could be a neighbor, it could be friends. Before you throw it out, you can use it to feed animals, or if you go to, probably you may have never done this, but we actually have a Mrs. Baird's bread store. It's not too far from campus, but they sell fresh, of course, Mrs. Baird's bread. But anything that's left over, farmers around town will come in and purchase it for to use to help supplement their livestock. There's some other different types of industrial uses, and then of course composting too. So the throwing out should really be our last resort. Turning now to seafood, our overfished species, our population whose survival is jeopardized due to harvesting at a rate that exceeds that fish species or seafood species ability to reproduce. So when we're taking a lot more out of the sea than allowing for them to actually reproduce and maintain that level. Here in the U.S., we really only consume about 10 different species of seafood, mostly shrimp, salmon, and Pangasus, which is like a catfish type of variety. It looks very much like tilapia, and tilapia is another one of those very commonly type of consumed fish that's out there. Um, about 70 to 85% of our seafood that's consumed in the U.S. actually comes from international sources. This is only, well, there's a few reasons why this could be problematic, but a big problem with consuming food or fish, seafood from outside of the U.S. is that the U.S. has one of the most sustainable fish practices and regulations that are out there. We really strive and have some good laws out there to help protect and have that sustainable fishing, whereas other countries do not use those practices, and so that is really counterintuitive to sustainable practices. Farm or wild caught, both of these uh, can and oftentimes, especially in the U.S., do use sustainable farming practices. They have lower environmental costs compared to overall meat production. So seafood, again, does not require as much feed. It doesn't require as much when it comes to manufacturing that type of protein that is used compared to fishing. So when you choose fish, especially fish that has been uh, produced in the U.S., then you are practicing food sustainability. We have a lot of rigorous standards here, as I mentioned, here in the US. So, a US seafood product on a fish label ensures that that fish or shellfish has been sustainably harvested. And I would say 99.9% of them actually have. Another great way of practicing food sustainability is purchasing from our local farmers, but understand that locally grown food, there's no specific definition or regulation that defines something as being locally grown, but those that call themselves a locavore, those are people who tend to purchase most of their foods from within 150 miles of where they live. And that helps in order to reduce emissions, so less greenhouse emissions, but also helps to support local farmers as well who may be struggling. So purchasing food from the farmers market is a great way to ensure that you're supporting your economy, especially your local economy, but also helping to really support sustainability. So another way that we can really support food sustainability are some programs like the National Farm to School Network. It services grades from K through 12 in order to connect our local farmers with schools. And so that benefits the kids because they are getting some fresh foods, but it also supports the farmers because they are getting to sell to those foods. So it helps to really connect those two entities, these organizations that are governmentally run, and also um, the farmers themselves that may not have had that opportunity before. So benefiting both, but it also helps with education because a lot of these programs will support maybe some of those little bitty school farms that helps kids get in there, learn how to plant, and also learn about the produce and sample them because many kids would not have the opportunity to actually sample these foods. And what we know about kids is if you have a hand in making something yourself as a child, you're a lot more likely to try it. So it really does produce more likelihood of kids having a variety of different tastes, flavors, and experiences with these foods that they might not have had if we didn't have these types of programs. Hydroponics. Now, on if you had a hard copy of your textbook, you would see on the outside an example of hydroponics. And I know A&M has a great program in there. I've seen before. I've seen it in different conventions. But this is the use of farming indoors, and it's the use of growing within water. It's really aesthetically pleasing too to be able to see some of these hydroponics that are out there. A lot of times hotels will have them out there, and is you'll see what looks like ivy or plants that are just growing in and kind of over fountains, but it's actually produce that they're growing. It produces great amount of yield using very little amount of land. Of course, we can do it inside. So it helps to reduce our resource use and also it recycles that water. So you're not losing as much water in this. Um, it really does help the farmers because you're not having to fight the weeds, having to put out some of the insecticides and fungicides in order to prevent harm or a reduced yield from those as well. So hydroponics is something, if you don't know a lot about it, to take some time to go into either your textbook or search the web to learn a little bit more about hydroponics.